Hello all, my name is Abdul Rahman and in this video we are going to talk about tables and keys. In the last video I have talked about primary key, surrogate key, natural key, or you could say business key, and we have talked about foreign key. So in this video I am going to continue. In this video I am going to continue that keys. I was talking about that keys, like I will be talking about some more keys like composite key and etc. So in this video I am going to talk about some more keys with examples of some tables as we have done in the last video. So let's go ahead and get started. So here I have the same employee table and branch table as we was having that in the last video, but in employee table I have added another attribute. Here I have added another attribute known as super ID. So here this is the attribute I have another added, which is super ID. So super stands for supervisor. So in short form I have written super. So this supervisor ID is going to define who is the supervisor. Is going to define that who is the supervisor of a particular employee. Okay, so an employee can be a supervisor of another employee. So here we have Ravi Kumar. Okay, so we have Ravi Kumar and his employee ID is 113 and his supervisor ID is 111. So that means his supervisor is the employee with the ID 111. That means his supervisor is the employee with the ID 111. So which means that his supervisor, Ravi Kumar's supervisor ID, employee ID is 111. So his supervisor is Preeti Agrawal, where she was born on 1964 and her gender is female, salary is this much, and her super ID is 110. Okay, and her branch ID is 2. So her supervisor, Preeti Agrawal's supervisor is William Thomas, because her supervisor ID is matching with his employee ID. So that's why he is the supervisor of the Preeti Agrawal, and Preeti Agrawal and Ravi Kumar. Preeti Agrawal is the supervisor of Ravi Kumar. So like that only we have Vijay Kumari, like she's that much salary and her super ID is 111, which means that her supervisor is also Preeti Agrawal. So now Preeti Agrawal supervisor ID is 110, which means Preeti Agrawal supervisor is the employee ID with 110, which is William Thomas. So here we can use foreign key on the employee table to define relationship between the employees. So I will be clearing these things. Okay. So here we can use the foreign key on the employee table to define relationship between the employees. Okay. So now we are defining a relationship between that employee table and the employee. We are defining the relationship between employee table and the employee. So now inside this employee table we can say that whose supervisor ID is who. Okay, so in this employee table we can say that, for example, Ravi Kumar's supervisor ID is this one, Preeti Agrawal. We can say that whose supervisor ID is who. We can find like that. So I can say that Ravi Kumar's supervisor is Preeti Agrawal, and so I can say that by defining the information. By using a foreign key. So now here I have another table. Okay, which is branch supplier table. So in the last video also we were having this employee table and branch table, but here in this slide I have one more table, which is branch supplier. So a branch supplier would define who the suppliers are for specific branches. So actually this is a branch supplier table. So a branch supplier would define who the suppliers are for specific branches. So we have these branches as they may be. So like we have some branches like they might be selling like paper, writing utensils, paper and etc. They might be selling a product like paper products. And the branch suppliers would define who are the suppliers for that branch, who is supplying that. Okay, for example, I am is there and there is another person, me and another person. So he has a company. So his branch is different and we have same company, but his branch is different and my branch is different. Okay, but I am supplying my product to that branch. So I am the supplier. Okay, I am the supplier of this branch. I am the supplier of the paper product. So and the branch suppliers would define who are the suppliers for that branch. As you can see here, in the branch supplier table, the primary key actually consists of two columns. And this is what we could call a composite key. So from the time in the last video and in this video, we were telling in these both tables, we were calling this employee ID as primary key and here branch ID as a primary key. But here we are calling these two columns as a branch ID, and this is what we could call is a composite key. So now we have another question. What is a composite key? A composite key is the DBMS key having database management system key having two or more attributes that together can uniquely identify a tuple in a table. Such a key is also known as compound key, where each attribute creating a key is a foreign key in its own right. So this key is made up of two columns. It's made of branch ID and supplier name. So in these two tables we have employee table and branch table. We are having only one primary key, which is branch ID, and here is the employee ID. But here in this table we are having branch ID and the supplier name, two columns as a primary key. So the branch ID is going to refer to the specific branch and supplier name is going to refer to specific supplier. Okay, so this primary key is made up of two columns. One is branch ID and another is supplier name. So branch ID is going to refer the specific branch and the supplier name is going to refer the specific supplier. Okay, branch ID is going to refer to the specific branch, from which branch it was coming, but supplier name would refer that who is the supplier. For example, I am the supplier of the branch, then it's going to refer specifically me because I am the supplier of the product. So supplier name is going to refer to the specific supplier. So we can see that here hammer mill supplies paper to here we have branch ID is 2 and what he is supplying, supplier type is paper, and hammer mill is supplying paper to whom, which ID. So this is the second ID, branch ID is 2 and here we can check is branch ID 2. Okay, so hammer mill is supplying paper to the aerospace. Okay, aerospace branch. So inside this branch supplier table we are able to define which different suppliers are supplying what to which different branches. Okay, we are able to define like he is supplying to this branch, like Uniball he is supplying to the aerospace only, and he is supplying writing and sales, and Patriot is supplying paper to whom its cybersecurity branch. Okay, and here Uniball is supplying. Okay, so the purpose that we need this composite key is because the supplier name doesn't uniquely identify each row, and branch ID doesn't uniquely identify each row. So the reason we need this composite key is because the supplier name doesn't uniquely identify each row. It can uniquely identify each row, and branch ID doesn't uniquely identify each row. Only both of them together can uniquely identify each row. When they are meeting together, they can uniquely identify each row. So when they are apart, they can't identify that. So as you can see in the branch supplier table, in the second column, the column has repeated values like hammer mill is repeated and Uniball is also repeated. Like here we have hammer mill. He is supplying paper to what? It's supplying paper to the aerospace. Okay, it's supplying paper to the aerospace. And hammer mill is again hammer mill. This branch is also supplying to the another branch. So that branch ID is 3, and it's cybersecurity branch, and he is supplying paper. And here we have Uniball, okay, where its ID is 2 only, so it's supplying writing and sales to the aerospace. And same here also, Uniball, it's supplying the same type of product to the cybersecurity. Its branch ID is 3, right? So it's supplying to the cybersecurity. So in the branch table, in the second column here, the hammer bill and the Uniball is not unique. They are repeated ones. That columns has repeated values like hammer mill, and Uniball is also repeated. They are also repeated. And in the table, branch ID also has those things repeated. Okay, and in the table, branch ID also has the same things repeated, like hammer mill is supplying to aerospace, and again Uniball is supplying the same things to him, like that only. Okay, so branch ID also has the things repeated. So branch ID column cannot uniquely identify the table and the supplier name, and cannot uniquely identify the table. Okay, so the branch ID cannot uniquely identify the each row, and supplier name cannot uniquely identify the table. So that's why here we have given to these two columns, we have given primary keys. In every this one here, we have given the employee ID as primary key, the first column, and this is the branch ID for the foreign key. Okay, but here we are giving branch ID, supplier name as primary keys, because each one, if you don't give them, for example, if we give the branch ID as a supplier name, then we can't, okay, then we cannot uniquely identify the table. Okay, but for example, if we here supplier name, if we have given the foreign key, then supplier name cannot uniquely identify the table. So only together they can uniquely identify it. So we can see that hammer mill supplies to branch 2. So hammer mill supply paper to branch 2, which is branch ID 2, so aerospace. So that combination only shows here, shows once. We cannot put the combination again because we are already defining it. So hammer mill supplies to branch 2 and branch 3. Here hammer mill is supplying paper to whom? Aerospace. And again hammer mill is supplying paper to whom? It's supplying to the cyber security. Right? So these two rows are uniquely identified by the supplier name and the branch ID. So in employee table and the branch table we have defined one column as a primary key. Here we have defined employee ID and branch ID. In this table we have defined employee ID as a primary key, but in branch table we have identified this one branch ID as a foreign key, primary key, sorry. So which is known as composite key, but here we have defined these two columns as primary key, which is known as composite key. So anyhow guys, so that's all for this, for tables and keys, and thanks for watching this video, and I will see you guys in another tutorial. Thanks for watching this video and thank you, bye bye.